So today we're going to take a look at another few examples of finding the equation of a line. And from the previous lesson, we knew that the m told us that that was the slope or the rate of change, and the b told us that it was the y-intercept or the initial value. So we're going to expand on that, and we're going to, there might be a little bit more algebra with this, so working not with tables, but to do some more work with that, with making the equations a little bit different. But I think in the end it'll make sense. So this was kind of a review from the previous lesson. Find the equation of the line. Well, the first thing we have to do is find the slope, and we know that that is rise over run. Well, we have to look at this graph, and I know that's kind of hard to see, so I'm going to zoom in here. When you're picking these things, you need to pick 2 points. All right, and the other thing we need to do is be able to put them on the grid nicely. So I'm going to look at that. I'm going to say that's a nice point, and I'm going to say that's a nice point. I know it's hard to see with this, but this one's a 2, that's a 5, and these one, that was a 1 and a 2. So we can look at that and say, well, we can find our rise and run. So if I look at this, this had a run of 1, and this one has a rise of 3. So I can say now this has a slope of 3 over 1, or just 3. Okay, so that's not too bad. The second thing we need to find is my y-intercept. And this is our b. And when we did this before, is we found the y-axis, and we figured out where it hits the y-axis. And if I look at that, it looks like it hits at 1. And we can actually confirm that, because if we went down 3 and run of 1, that would get me that point. So that's about b of -1. Therefore, my equation I can replace m with 3, and I can replace b with -1. There's my answer. So we determined the slope, we determined the y-intercept, we determined the equation. So step 1, step 2, step 3. And the way we did that is we needed 2 points. So we needed 2 points to understand how that works. All right. So what I would like you to do is try the same thing with this one. I know it's hard to see, but I'm going to push pause, and you're going to try to see how that works. All right. So when you're looking at my answer here, you may say to yourself, Mr. Z, I didn't pick those same 2 points. And that is perfectly fine. But in the end, it doesn't matter what points you pick, you will still get the same answers. And so I picked the points 0, 6, and 3, 3. I thought those hit the lines nicely. I figured out my rise and run. And before, we knew that this line was decreasing. So this had to be a negative slope. And I know I went down 3, run a 3. Well, if I was reducing that fraction, it's the same as doing 3 little steps of 1 over 1. And that's where I got the -1. So here I could divide this out. All right, so I can divide here if I wanted to. All right, but make sure you leave it as negative. And my y-intercept is 6 because it hits the y-axis here, so this is my y-axis. Okay, and then I got my equation. So find your slope, find your y-intercept, give it a go. So that's one way of finding the equation. I could also find the equation from a table of values, and we did this in the last lesson. And the way we did that is still do find the slope as rise over run and find my y-intercept. All right, so first thing is I'm going to find my slope. So we know that this is our rise and this is our run. I ask myself, okay, what's happening with those points? Well, that looks like it's going down 2. That's down 2. That's down 2. This looks like it's adding 5. All right, so I can find my slope as negative 2 over 5. And if it's just regular, I can leave that as a fraction. If we're talking about money or an application, you can make it a decimal, but we wanted it to be a nice decimal. Now, the question is, what is our b? Where's our y-intercept? Well, if I'm looking at the graph, this table here, it's hard to tell me the equation. But let's go back to here. One of the things we noticed here is if I drew in my line here, my y-intercept has a point of 0 and 6. Well, it's my y-intercept is where x is equal to 0. Well, on that graph, in that table, do we see where x equals 0? We sure do. It's right here. My y-intercept there. So my y-intercept there is 1. It's wherever x is equal 0, what's the value of y? And then from there, I can say y equals mx plus b, y equals negative 2 over 5, x plus 1. So this is my equation. Okay, so I've just substituted m and b into my equation. So this is the end goal. All right. So using that same analogy here, I want you to find the slope, find the y-intercept, find the equation. Give it a go. All right, so what I did there, it took a couple of minutes. All right, I found my slope by doing the rise and run. How much are those changing by? Rate of change, same idea. All right, this was rising by 4, and this was running by 2, and then I combined to get 2. I found that the y-intercept was 1. And you're going to say, Mr. Brzee, I think you're a little crazy here. I don't see anywhere on that graph where it's 1. But one of the ways of doing that is maybe I can use this table to go backwards. Because as we are figuring out some information, we can, if we go forwards, we can find information. So here, if I added 2, this is 10. Here I added 4, that's 21. That would be another point. And I could keep going by adding 2 here and adding 4 there. Well, I can go backwards. So what I can do is, well, if I went backwards, that gets me 0. Ooh, there's a good one because we know that's got to be where the y-intercept is. Well, if I went back to over here, I have to go back 4 this way. And right there, all right, that's where x equals 0. It's my starting value. Start at 0. All right. So sometimes we have to do a little bit of thinking, but that's okay. All right. And by plugging in these two, I can get my answer. All right. Plug in 2 for M, 1 for B. I can write my answer. All right. So we've talked about making the equation from the graph. We've talked about making the equations from a table. Now we're going to give you some stuff where it's kind of arbitrary. It's kind of like him and there. And what I'm going to tell you though is, doing this, I can still use the techniques that I've used here. So let's take a look at it. A line that passes through -3, 4, and 2 and 19. So one of the things that we're going to look at is there's another way of finding this answer for my y-intercept. I want to kind of take it aside a little bit because that's going to help us find that. We know to find the y-intercept, all right, we want to find b. And to do that, we're going to say y equals mx plus b. And then what we're going to do is we're going to solve for b. We have to know m. Well, if I know m is 2, I can put 2 there for m. The second thing is, if I look at this, m is the slope, and xy is a point. And what we can do is take any point that we have here and we can sub it in this equation, solve for b. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take 2 and 5. So I'm going to say my 5 is going to be y and my x is going to be 2. Then I'm going to solve for b. And you're going to say to me, well, you know, Mr. Brzee, we've already solved equations. We know how to solve that equation. So I have 5 equals 4 plus b. And we look at that and say, well, is b by itself? No. So here I'm going to make 0 pairs. All right. That's a 0 pair. I'm left with 1. I found my y-intercept. So anytime when we don't know what the y-intercept is, we can make an equation to solve for it. All right, and it's going to work the same way here. And we can always take an educated guess as well to find these equations. But in the end, they will always work. All right, so previous lessons, we talked about using a formula. So we could do y2 minus y1, x2 or x1. That's fine. I'm going to use a table. Still gets me the same answer. All right, so I'm going to put my points in a table. All right, and just like we did up here, we're going to find our rise and run. So that looks like it's risen 15, and this one is increased by 5. So I can say now my slope is equal to rise over run is 15 over 5, which is 3. All right. To find my y-intercept, b, I'm going to use m equals 3, and I pick a point. So you could pick this point or this point, it won't matter. As long as you don't mix up the x's and y's. Don't mix up, make sure the x is 2 and the y is 19. And then what you do is put it into this equation. That's the same equation for the equation of a line. Sub in your points. Y is 19, m is 3, x is 2, plus b. I can solve that equation. 6 plus b. I can make some 0 pairs. There we go. So now I can make my equation. Y equals m is 3 plus 13. So there is my work there. So there's still 3 steps. Find your slope, find your rise and run, find your value b, the y-intercept. All right, and I can use my slope and a point to figure that out. All right, and then I can make my equation by taking my MB. All right, so we're going to continue. We're going to try a couple more of these, and I know this will be tough. But what I would like you to do is try to do the same thing as we did in the last question. All right, so I'm going to set up my table here. So 2 and 40, 5 and 10. All right, I can find my slope, and then I'm going to push pause and find your slope first, and then we'll come back to do the y-intercept. All right, so I found my slope by taking the rise and the run, and you'll look at that and you'll say, oh, that's interesting. The slope is actually negative there, and you can actually see that as we're increasing the x, the y is decreasing. So a slope of that's negative makes sense here. All right, so I'm going to hit pause again, but I want you to do is substitute m equals negative 10, and then pick a point that you would like to choose. So you can pick either one of these points. I'm going to let you choose, and it won't matter. All right, go ahead, solve the y-intercept. And I chose 240, 2 and 40, and I got an answer of 60. And I'm going to talk about, okay, does that really make sense? All right, and so sometimes you can do a little sketch. All right, so let's say here's 2 and 40. Let's say that's 10 there. And then we have 5 and 10 here. So here's the 2 points we have. Does an answer of 60 make sense if we drew this line? If I drew it straight, my y-intercept of 60 makes sense, because it's got to be more than 40 because the line is decreasing. Another way of saying this is if I went back to my table of values here, I could ask myself, well, what do I have to do to get back to 0 here? Well, here I'd have to subtract 2. Well, if my rate of change is 10 here, decreasing, for every 1 step, this one has to increase by 20. Well, what's 40 plus 20? 60. Now, this doesn't work all the time when using this, but that's a good check. All right, so a good check is to draw a little graph to make for the y-intercept. Or extend the table. All right, and that should be a good check to make sure that your answer makes sense for the y-intercept. All right, now last thing you have to do is make an equation. So y equals mx plus b negative 10, because m is negative 10 over here. M is negative 10 over there. X, so x and y always stays, plus 60. So that was the equation for that. Okay. The last 2 questions are actually easier. So if you look at that, I'm given slope of 2/3 and a point. Well, first thing it asks us is, what's the slope? If we're trying to make an equation. Well, we know that m is 2/3. That's really easy. Check mark, done. Y-intercept, we don't know. But we know from the original question, from the previous one, if we know a slope and a point, we can find the y-intercept. Well, guess what we know? We know that our m is 2/3, and we know our point, xy, is 9, -4. Now, there are some times where, you know what, our y-intercept may not be a whole number, but that's okay. If our y-intercept is not a whole number, it's okay, because guess what, our slope is not a whole number either. That's okay. So, let's plug in our stuff. All right, so I've got, all right, sub in our y is -4. Our slope is 2/3. Our x is 9 plus b. We're going to solve for b now. Okay. So, if we have fractions, we have to make sure we got to remind ourselves, how do we multiply fractions? All right, so I'm going to put a 1 over that, just so that we know how to multiply fractions. 2 times 9 is 18, plus b, and this will reduce nicely to 6. Okay, we got lucky there. All right, now I'll solve for b. 6 is, we want to move the 6 to the other side. Okay, so -10 equals b. All right, so now we know our two things that helps us. We know this makes our equation. All right, and add some English to it. Tell me what you're solving for in each step, and then it becomes clear of what you're trying to solve, and it'll help you to understand it moving forward. All right, so it really depends on what you're given. If you're given the slope and a point, well, it's always still a good idea to write down what you know, so that you can look at what you're dealing with. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to push pause here. I want you to try to do the same steps here for this, and then I'll come back and I will tell you what's the answer. All right, so from the equation, slope equals -2, and it passes through that point. Well, what I know here is I know this, so I know my value of m. I have to go back and find my value b, but I can use the slope m, and I can use my point xy to be able to plug into my equation to isolate b. So I substituted y for 5, m for -2, x for -3. Did some bed mass. -2 times -3 is +6. Bring the 6 to the other side, so I have to subtract 6 from both sides. Get -1. And that can make that. So that's kind of the skill set that you're looking at. If you're a person who likes the visual of this, you could plot it on a graph to see. So if you don't have graph paper, you can plot this into your Desmos if you want to plot in a Desmos to see if it works. All right, you can check it on Desmos to see, okay, where does it hit going from there. So one of the things you can do is you can actually check your answer by typing in y equals negative 2x minus 1. And the point that we had to have was, if I went back to the question, negative 3 comma 5. Well, if I'm looking at that, there's my equation, and there's my point. If it's on the line, that's a good thing. And you can also say here, there's my y-intercept of negative 1. So it does help you to look at those things. Here is the other one, y equals 2/3 x, no, x minus 10. Right, well, we can zoom in on this a little bit. And the point that we had there, let's get rid of that point and get rid of that line. All right, so the green line is y equals 2/3 x minus 10. And we had a point of 9 comma negative 4. Well, there's my point 9 negative 4. There's my y-intercept of negative 10. It all works out. My slope is 2/3. So you can use Desmos as a way of checking your answers as well. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of help understanding that. So those are the two answers to that. So you can use Desmos to check your answer to make sure it makes sense. Hopefully that helps. But this is what our goal was. Can I determine the slope of the equation? Can I determine the y-intercept of the linear relationship? And can I determine the equation? And all those three things will help you with getting to the answer. All right, good luck.